It is possible that the ancient astronauts taught the Egyptians that mummification was a way of preserving their genetic information in the DNA.
For nearly a century, Tutankhamun was seen as a minor boy king, remembered mostly for the golden treasures found in his tomb. But behind the famous mask was a far darker story. Modern DNA analysis has revealed shocking details about his family, health, and sudden death. The evidence points to royal inbreeding, inherited illness, and a dynasty slowly collapsing from within. Tutankhamun's remains now tell a story more tragic than legend, one where power, bloodlines, and belief collided, leaving behind not just a golden tomb, but a genetic mystery buried for thousands of years. Mystery behind Tutankhamun's legacy. For decades, King Tutankhamun has stood as an icon of ancient Egypt, known mainly for the dazzling treasures discovered in his tomb. Yet, despite his fame, surprisingly little was understood about the boy king himself. 9 years on the throne and died at age 19, Tutankhamun wasn't celebrated for grand achievements or monumental conquests. His reign was brief and largely overshadowed by the religious upheaval initiated by his predecessor. Still, the artifacts that survived suggested there was more beneath the surface, something that the golden mask alone could never reveal. The world had accepted a simplified image, a tragic youth caught in a dynastic drama, forgotten soon after his death. But questions lingered about his parentage, health, and the origins of his unique features that neither archaeology nor written records could fully settle. The debates about where Tutankhamun fit within Egypt's tangled royal lineage were contentious and inconclusive for years. Archaeology gave clues, but those clues were obscured by centuries of damage, misunderstanding, and political rewriting. It was as though the boy king had been erased from history, preserved only by fortune and chance. This mystery deepened because the family to which Tutankhamun belonged was no ordinary royal line. The 18th dynasty was marked by unusual choices and controversies, including radical religious reforms and tightly knit family marriages. The golden mask and tomb treasures represented an image polished and idealized, while the true story of Tutankhamun's life was far rougher and more complex. The physical evidence embedded in the bones of the mummies whispered of illnesses, deformities, and genetic burdens that the dazzling mask concealed. Still, without biology, these hints remained mute. The sealed tomb and its fabulous contents had fascinated the world since 1922. Yet for decades, the most pressing questions, who Tutankhamun really was and why his family looked the way they did, went unanswered. The method to unlock these questions arrived only with the advancements in DNA technology. Science promised to move beyond speculation, to read the genetic record preserved in the ancient remains. This was more than a mere family tree. It was a chance to understand how bloodlines and biology intersected with history and myth. What the DNA would uncover didn't really reinforce the old assumptions. It kind of shattered them instead. It would dismantle long-standing narratives and then make specialists rethink everything, from Tutankhamun's parentage to the entire nature of the dynasty that produced him. For the first time, biology would confirm facts that texts and artifacts simply couldn't reach, showing unexpected connections and those tucked-away family dynamics. The truth was in the double helix all along, sealed inside mummified tissues, waiting for modern science to decode it. Tutankhamun's legacy, it turns out, isn't only about a boy king's tragic end. It's also about the collapse of a carefully controlled royal bloodline. His body, disease-ridden and fragile, mirrored a dynasty unspooling from the inside. Secrets that artifacts alone could never expose sat beneath his golden mask, and they were written plainly in his DNA. Once those revelations land, they'd change forever how we see Tutankhamun, and also the royal family that shaped a tense, turbulent slice of Egyptian history. Still, the biological story was only one part of the puzzle. The background of his family's beginnings and the way their features combined in a manner that confounded observers for decades, that mattered just as much. Those details stirred intense debates that were tangled up with politics, identity, and scholarly disagreements that never really stayed contained. Because when an ancient lineage challenges modern perceptions, the consequences resonate well beyond Egyptology, into everything people think they already know. So, unpacking this mystery really meant we had to move past the glittering stuff in the tomb and dig into the genetic lineage of Tutankhamun's family. Which sounds simple until you see how inheritance can be shaped by choices that were deliberate, yet still end up with unintended consequences. The account DNA gave was kinda there already, just waiting for folks who actually wanted to hear it, quietly stored under thousands of years of sand and rock. After that, the next discoveries made it obvious. What was hidden under the mask looked far stranger and also more delicate than the objects that made Tutankhamun famous in the first place. Those results would then carry us straight toward comprehending the relatives who raised him and the lasting imprint they left behind, even if it was never meant to last. As the truth of Tutankhamun's family unfolds, we come to see how the dynasty's unique approach to bloodline purity sealed its fate in ways no human eye could have forecast. Unique bloodline of the 18th dynasty. The royal family of Egypt's 18th dynasty was unlike any other, not just in power, but in genetics. For generations, they followed a deliberate practice of marrying within the family to maintain the divine bloodline, a concept deeply ingrained in Egyptian ideology. Pharaohs married sisters, half-sisters, and even daughters, all aimed at preserving a sacred lineage untouched by outside influences. This policy was both a cultural and religious ideal, but biology would eventually expose its harsh realities. This closed genetic circle effectively created a breeding ground for inherited health problems. Each generation lost genetic diversity, narrowing the pool of traits and increasing the expression of recessive genes linked to disease and deformity. Over time, these effects accumulated invisibly, written deep into the bones and DNA of royal descendants. This inbreeding was no accident, but a central principle that defined the dynasty's identity and legitimacy. Tutankhamun's grandfather, Amenhotep III, symbolized the dynasty's peak, one of the most powerful rulers in Egyptian history. His queen, Tiye, was influential and unique, with her mummified remains revealing distinct physical features that defied conventional ideas about ancient Egyptian appearance. Tiye's parents, Yuya and Thuya, further added unexpected complexity, with Yuya's almost blonde hair and sharply defined features challenging common assumptions about the royal family's ethnicity. These details fueled decades of debate and discomfort among scholars and the public alike. When Akhenaten ascended the throne, he dramatically reshaped not only religion, but also the family structure. Renouncing Egypt's traditional gods, he introduced monotheistic worship of Aten and elevated his own lineage in unprecedented ways. Akhenaten married his great royal wife Nefertiti and fathered multiple daughters with her, but his most famous child, Tutankhamun, was born to another woman, whose identity would later be a major focus of genetic studies. The dynasty's strict rules about bloodline purity persisted amid these changes. The family's commitment to inbreeding had pretty tragic biological consequences, if you think about it. Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, both children of Amenhotep III and Tiye. That choice pushed genetic risk up to extreme levels really fast. Because the relation was that close, the odds of inheriting harmful mutations went higher, and it weakened Tutankhamun's health in a deep, lasting way. So the genetic cost of that policy wasn't one time. It was carried forward each new generation, until you end up with a young king burdened with multiple congenital ailments. But it's not only about the individual. This kind of marital strategy fractures the dynasty's future too. Those intimate marriages meant that disease-linked variants accumulated over time, rather than getting diluted or fading out. The whole idea was to keep the royal bloodline aligned with some kind of divine essence. Yet, the effect was more like shrinking the genetic variety that was available. With each successive generation, the dynasty became more fragile. What began as a supposed strength ultimately turned into a liability that the royal family really couldn't escape. And this dynastic self-isolation, it contrasts strongly with the broader Egyptian population. People outside the royal circle were genetically more diverse. While members of the royal bloodline married only within their closed circle, ordinary Egyptians drew from a wider gene pool. In a way, it reflected that rich blend of cultures and peoples along the Nile. That distinction shaped more than appearance alone. It also affected vulnerability to disease and the ability to adapt when conditions changed. So the 18th dynasty's bloodline preserved its divine image while paying for it with biological health. That setup created conditions for a collapse that went beyond politics or even conquest. From this angle, Tutankhamun's fate doesn't look like an isolated misfortune. It reads more like a bloody ledger of generations of deliberate choices, stacked up and finally paid back. Understanding this strategy matters because it helps you see the biological revelations that DNA would later reveal in detail. History and archaeology alone had glossed over or missed entirely. From this tightly sealed genetic world, unexpected clues about origins and identity began to emerge, challenging perceptions of Egypt's past. Unexpected physical traits and genetic markers. The physical appearance of Tutankhamun and his family was a source of mystery and debate for over a century, fueled by the striking features seen in preserved mummies and ancient art. Early Egyptologists were often unprepared for the traits they uncovered, traits that diverged from popular expectations of what ancient Egyptians should look like. Yuya, Tutankhamun's great-grandfather, was particularly baffling. His nearly blonde hair, prominent nose, and sharp facial features created a puzzle that defied easy classification. Facial reconstructions based on CT scan data from the early 2000s helped visualize Tutankhamun himself as a young man whose visage did not match the smooth, idealized images on his mask. These reconstructions suggested a fragile individual, bearing features that some described as unusual or even non-Egyptian. These observations became focal points for controversy, sparking heated debates not just about ethnicity, but about the origins of the dynasty. The long-standing disagreements often split along lines of perception versus geography. Some experts insisted that visual and artistic evidence reflected a non-African or Near Eastern influence. Others pointed out that linking appearance directly to ethnicity oversimplified complex historical realities and risked modern political biases shaping ancient narratives. Without genetic evidence, these debates were largely unresolved and frequently fraught. A broader genetic study published in 2017 by researchers at the Max Planck Institute provided groundbreaking context. Analyzing DNA from 90 mummies spanning 14 centuries at a site south of Cairo, the study found that the ancient Egyptians shared very little DNA with modern sub-Saharan African populations. Instead, their closest genetic relatives were ancient farmers from the Levant, Anatolian groups, and Neolithic Europeans. This finding reframed the biological background of Egypt's population during its dynastic peak. Modern Egyptians, in contrast, carry approximately 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient mummies did. This shift likely occurred during the medieval period, highlighting that the genetic makeup of Egypt's population has changed significantly over time. The ancient population itself was genetically distinct from the one living in the region today. The 18th dynasty royal family, operating within this ancient Egyptian genetic framework, amplified these features through generations of internal marriage. The characteristics that drew so much attention The pale skin indicators and prominent facial structures were not anomalies, but evidence of ancestry linked clearly to the ancient Near East. The DNA data helped dissolve myths, showing that these families were a complex blend shaped by broad regional patterns. Genetic markers for pigmentation and other traits found in ancient Near Eastern populations appeared in the royal remains as well, suggesting a biological connection to groups across a wider area than previously assumed. These patterns illuminated not only physical appearance, but also the history of population movement and cultural exchange in the region. The weight of the genetic evidence undercut simplistic racial categories and illustrated how the 18th dynasty embodied a convergence of cultures and lineages shaped by history rather than assumption. In this way, the scientific analysis transformed once contentious debates into a clearer understanding of royal identity and ancestry. This revelation set the stage for the full genetic story of Tutankhamun's family, a story that would explain not just appearance, but health, parentage, and ultimately, the fate of a dynasty. Tutankhamun's genetics would soon redefine everything known about his parents, health struggles, and the dynasty's destiny. Confirming parentage through DNA. One of the most groundbreaking revelations from the DNA analysis of Tutankhamun's family was the definitive identification of his parents. For much of the 20th century, Egyptologists debated fiercely over who his mother was, with candidates proposed and dismissed repeatedly. The mummies offered clues, but without biological evidence, no consensus was possible. This changed when a comprehensive study examined DNA extracted from 11 royal mummies of the New Kingdom period, cross-referencing genetic data with CT scans and known historical records. The analysis confirmed that Tutankhamun's father was the mummy known as KV55, a figure long suspected but never conclusively identified. Science settled the argument once and for all. KV55 was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who had sparked Egypt's religious upheaval. This father-son relationship was not determined by inscriptions or artifacts, but by the biological evidence encoded deep within their remains. This breakthrough alone redefined Tutankhamun's place within his family and history. More startling was the identification of Tutankhamun's mother. The DNA study revealed that she was the mummy named the Younger Lady, found in tomb K535. She was not Nefertiti, as some had speculated, but rather a daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tia. This made Tutankhamun's parents full siblings, a brother and sister union rather than a more distant relation. Such a degree of inbreeding was among the most extreme ever documented in a royal lineage. This close genetic relationship explained many of the health complications observed in Tutankhamun and cast new light on the family dynamics within the 18th dynasty. The deliberate strategy to preserve the divine bloodline through sibling marriages now had a documented biological cost. The high inbreeding coefficient reported in the study quantified the genetic risks passed down to Tutankhamun. The broader implications of finding these familial relationships were pretty major. It was not just that it helped sort out old genealogies, but it also put an end to long-standing uncertainties that archaeology and ancient texts alone could not touch. The biology of those mummies told this story that felt richer and honestly more tragic than what you get from inscriptions carved on temple walls. It suggested a family line trying to keep its purity intact while at the same time weakening its own future viability, bit by bit. Even if Nefertiti's exact place is still kind of hard to pin down, the DNA results backed up her role as the mother of Akhenaten's 6 daughters. Still, she didn't show up among the mummies that were analyzed. So yeah, her absence keeps a few things unresolved, but it does not lower the confidence we gained about the other relatives. Once that framework was set, the situation around Tutankhamun's immediate parents became much clearer, and that helps explain how nature and nurture both played into his short life. Confirming his parentage also reshaped how scholars looked at the physical evidence from Tutankhamun's remains. Because he was the offspring of a full sibling marriage, assessments of his ailments and his genetic risks could be treated differently. It basically offered a biological basis for medical conclusions that previously were either speculative or ended up being not really conclusive. With that kind of clarity, the dynasty pressures started to look more obvious. That tight genetic circle not only affected one boy king, but it also left traces across the whole royal line. Tutankhamun's fragile health turned into a visible sign of centuries of incestuous marriages used to protect royal legitimacy. And when the DNA study laid out the relationships so specifically, it opened the door to understanding not only who Tutankhamun was, but why he suffered so intensely from genetic diseases. A mystery which the Golden Mask had kept hidden for ages. The biological revelations about Tutankhamun's parents deepen our understanding of the young king's frail condition, linking genetics to illness and mortality in ways that the tomb's treasures hint at but never explain. Diseases, disabilities, and early death. Tutankhamun's mummy reveals a young king whose body had been weakened by multiple inherited conditions, many likely linked to the close relationship between his parents. CT scans and DNA analysis uncovered a series of physical disorders that would have affected his health throughout his short life. One of the most significant was a club foot on his left leg, making walking painful and difficult. The discovery of more than 130 walking canes in his tomb suddenly made sense. They were not ceremonial objects, but essential aids for mobility. His left foot also showed signs of bone necrosis, a condition known as Kohler's disease, caused by a loss of blood supply to the bone. In addition, he had a curved spine and a cleft palate, further evidence that his health had been compromised from birth. Together, these conditions painted the picture of a frail ruler struggling with lifelong disabilities rather than a healthy young pharaoh. His health was further threatened by malaria. DNA testing detected Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest malaria parasite, with evidence suggesting he suffered repeated infections. For someone already weakened by congenital disorders, the disease would have placed enormous strain on his body and reduced his ability to recover from illness or injury. For decades, Tutankhamun's death inspired theories of slaying. A bone fragment inside his skull led many to believe he had been assassinated. However, modern scans have largely dismissed that idea, showing the damage likely occurred during or after mummification rather than at the time of death. Instead, researchers believe he died from a combination of severe illness and injury. A fractured leg, possibly caused by a fall or accident, became life-threatening when combined with malaria and his weakened physical condition. His body simply lacked the strength to recover. Even the objects buried with him tell part of the story. Honey and medicinal plants were placed in the tomb, suggesting physicians had tried to treat infections and chronic ailments during his lifetime. The family's genetic struggles extended beyond Tutankhamun himself. He and his wife, Ankhesenamun, had 2 daughters, but both were stillborn. These losses reflect the reproductive problems that plagued the royal family and further weakened the dynasty. Tutankhamun's death was therefore more than the tragedy of a single king. It marked the culmination of generations of close royal marriages, inherited illness, and declining genetic health. His remains preserve the story of a dynasty whose greatest effort to protect its bloodline ultimately became the very cause of its downfall. These physical and genetic burdens tell a larger story, one that reveals the intricate connections between heritage, health, and history within Tutankhamun's family, setting the stage for the collapse that followed. The dynasty's genetic decline and collapse. Tutankhamun's health problems were not his alone. They were signs of a dynasty collapsing from within. For generations, Egypt's 18th dynasty royal family married within a narrow circle to preserve what they believed was a divine bloodline. But this practice reduced genetic diversity and increased the chances of harmful inherited conditions. Tutankhamun was one of the clearest examples of this decline. DNA studies suggest his parents were full siblings, creating an extreme genetic bottleneck. This close family connection likely contributed to his fragile body, inherited illnesses, and vulnerability to disease. What was meant to protect royal purity instead weakened the royal line. The consequences reached beyond Tutankhamun's own health. Fertility problems and failed pregnancies appear throughout the family's final generations. Tutankhamun's 2 daughters were stillborn, leaving him without an heir. Without viable children to continue the bloodline, the dynasty faced a crisis that no ritual or royal tradition could solve. The collapse of the 18th dynasty was not caused by a foreign invasion or sudden disaster. It was a slow biological exhaustion. The royal family had trapped itself inside its own ideology. By valuing blood purity above genetic health, it weakened the very lineage it hoped to preserve. After Tutankhamun's death, Egypt's throne went to Ai and then to Horemheb, sort of in a chain that felt not exactly smooth. Neither of them was a direct royal heir in the same dynastic line, so it counted as a dramatic change in succession, and you could feel that break right away. The bloodline that once produced some of Egypt's most remembered rulers, it sort of simply ran out of descendants that could actually keep going, in any practical sense. The desperation of that moment comes through in Ankhesenamun's reported letter to the Hittite king. She asks him to send one of his sons, as in, to become her husband, and then Egypt's king. For an Egyptian queen to look toward a foreign prince like that was unusual, nearly shocking. It basically tells you, without saying it, that the dynastic crisis had gotten terribly serious. Modern genetics adds another layer to the whole story, one that feels a bit more personal and also harsher. The fall wasn't only political, it was biological too. Chronic illness, reproductive trouble, and inherited frailty were linked to generations of close royal marriage. With Tutankhamun's case, DNA evidence suggests how private family decisions could end up steering the fate of an empire, like a domino you never see until it's already falling. So the end of the 18th dynasty reads like a strong warning. Its rulers tried to keep the sacred blood intact, but their approach narrowed that bloodline over time, until it couldn't keep surviving, not in the way they hoped. Tutankhamun wasn't only the boy king in a golden tomb. He becomes, in a way, the last shaky chapter of a royal family that kept believing in its own rules, even as those rules weighed down the entire line. When the dynasty's bloodline vanished, so too did the visibility of their legacy, a disappearance that Horemheb ensured would be more than just genealogical. The erasure of Tutankhamun's name. After Tutankhamun's death, a deliberate campaign sought to erase him from history. When the general Horemheb became pharaoh after Ai, he systematically removed the young king's name from Egypt's monuments and official records. In ancient Egyptian belief, a person's name was essential to their soul. Erasing it meant condemning them to a second death, wiping away their existence for eternity. Horemheb ordered Tutankhamun's cartouches chiseled away from temples and monuments, replacing them with his own. Structures the young king had commissioned, including parts of Luxor and Karnak, were claimed as Horemheb's achievements. Over the course of his 14-year reign, nearly every visible trace of Tutankhamun's rule disappeared. The campaign proved astonishingly successful. For more than 3,000 years, Tutankhamun faded from history. By the time Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC, his name had vanished from public memory. Later visitors, including Julius Caesar and Napoleon, saw Egypt's magnificent monuments but found no mention of the forgotten boy king. Yet one thing escaped destruction. Hidden beneath layers of rubble, Tutankhamun's tomb remained sealed. Shortly after his burial, a rainstorm and later construction accidentally concealed the entrance, protecting his mummy, treasures, and burial chamber from grave robbers. While his name disappeared from history, his physical remains endured in silence. When archaeologists finally uncovered the tomb, modern science accomplished what ancient politics could not. DNA analysis and forensic studies brought Tutankhamun's story back to life, revealing his family connections, inherited illnesses, and the consequences of royal inbreeding. His preserved remains exposed truths that no ruler could erase. This remarkable contrast highlights the difference between cultural memory and biological evidence. Monuments can be defaced, inscriptions rewritten, and official histories manipulated, but DNA preserves a record beyond the reach of ideology. Tutankhamun's genetic legacy survived even after his public identity was deliberately erased. Horemheb believed removing the young king's name would erase him forever. Instead, thousands of years later, science restored the identity that history had tried to destroy. The golden mask made Tutankhamun famous, but it was the evidence hidden within his tomb that revealed the human being behind the legend. His story stands as a powerful reminder that while rulers may reshape history, they cannot always erase the truth. Sometimes, the greatest witness to the past lies not in monuments or inscriptions, but in the silent evidence preserved beneath the sands of time. The survival of Tutankhamun's biology would soon reveal patterns not unique to Egypt, but echoed across continents and ages, reframing how we think about ancient populations everywhere. Broader impact of ancient DNA studies. The discoveries surrounding Tutankhamun's family are only part of a much larger story. Advances in ancient DNA research are transforming our understanding of human history, revealing that many once thriving populations disappeared without leaving direct genetic descendants. The fate of Egypt's 18th dynasty reflects a global pattern of rise, decline, and replacement. A 2017 study by the Max Planck Institute analyzed 90 ancient Egyptian mummies and found that people living during Tutankhamun's era were genetically closer to ancient populations from the Levant, Anatolia, and Neolithic Europe than to modern Egyptians. Today's Egyptians have greater sub-Saharan African ancestry due to centuries of later migration and mixing, showing how dramatically populations can change over time. Other discoveries kind of reinforce this overall picture. I mean, it's not just one piece of evidence. Ancient remains from northern Israel revealed genetic traits, like fair skin and blue eyes, which challenge the usual assumptions people make about how early Near Eastern peoples looked. Those groups also seem to have fed into the ancestry of populations across the region, including groups tied to Egypt's 18th dynasty. Ancient DNA has uncovered sort of similar stories worldwide. Research on pre-Columbian mummies in the Americas turned up 84 maternal lineages that look like they're completely gone now, with no surviving branches left. In Colombia, scientists found signs of an ancient population that vanished and was entirely replaced by another group around 2,000 years ago. Meanwhile, 7,000-year-old genomes from Libya belong to some strange ghost population, unlike any people you could point to living today. Taken together, these findings suggest that population replacement and even extinction have happened throughout history. The extinction of Tutankhamun's royal bloodline isn't some rare exception. It's more like part of the same recurring human story. Their monuments, culture, and achievements stayed around, but their genetic legacy did not. Ancient DNA is reshaping how we interpret the past, showing how civilizations flourished, migrated, and sometimes vanished. So history ends up being written in stone, but not always carried on by living descendants. Tutankhamun's DNA reminds us that history is not only preserved in stone and gold, but in the fragile blueprint of life itself. If this glimpse into ancient genetics fascinated you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories where science and history collide. And before you go, watch the next video on your screen, where another hidden chapter of the ancient world is waiting to be uncovered.